So welcome. This is part of a series of, so EBBF is this global community, as the mission of EBBF is a Baha'i-inspired global learning community that accompanies. So as an organization, we said, how can we accompany? What are some of these Baha'i principles? What are some of these people that can help us to manage the current situation and make sense of it all, or help us in assistance? And right now what we've been observing, I think, is that the word community, the concept of community, and it can be our neighborhood, it can be our city, our nation, the global community. This concept of communities really has come to the center of much of what we do. And therefore we just said, who do we know in the EBBF network that can give us a hand and just tell us a thing or two about community building and so forth. And we're just so lucky at the EBBF. We've got this mine of gems of inestimable value, never better said. And so we thank especially Jenna, Carrie, and Todd for taking some time out from these crazy busy times to just share some of their knowledge. But they've been working for a number of years in community building. And so just to get started, maybe Jenna, Carrie, Todd, what are you working on? And when we're talking about communities, what kind of communities have been serving in the last few years? Just to introduce you.
Hi, it's really a pleasure to be with you all today, and thank you for putting this together, Daniel, and for everyone for joining. So our work at Impact Experience is really focused on building bridges between communities that have been historically underinvested in, and funders and entrepreneurs and artists both in those communities and elsewhere. And so some examples of some of the communities that we've been working in is in, for example, Southern West Virginia, a community with incredibly high rates of diabetes, obesity, drug offense rates, and many laid off coal miners. And our partner in that community actually is a healthcare clinic. And so particularly right now, we've been in very close contact with them around a lot of what they're doing as it relates to COVID-19, but also in places like Puerto Rico after the hurricanes there, actually in a number of places post natural disasters. So in Houston after the hurricanes there, in Sonoma, and our lens within each of the communities that we work in is really looking at engaging the most marginalized within those communities, and particularly looking at it through a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So a lot of the communities that we've been working in are certainly right at the front lines of a lot of the both challenges that are going on right now, but also at the front lines in terms of both resiliency and a lot of the adaptive processes that they've developed. So it's been pretty amazing engaging with them, particularly at this point in time. So really excited to be with you all today, and happy to dive deeper into that.
Very much. Thank you very much. Carrie.
So Todd and I are the co-CEOs of Second Muse, and for the last 11 years, we've really spent our energy and effort on building out collaborative efforts, building community at local scales as well as at the global scale to affect systems change and build economies that are really for the benefit of people and the planet. And so we've really done this across many different types of industry sectors and geographies. At one of our last counts, we had somewhere upwards of like 50 different communities, in a sense, in parentheses, that we've really been helping to bolster and catalyze and support. And those range from volunteer technologists that are coming together all around the globe to develop out different types of earth science solutions, whether those be climate change or agriculture or disaster response or all sorts of different types of things. So we run one of the world's largest global hackathons with NASA, to engaging in local resilient communities, focusing on entrepreneurs in different parts of more rural United States. And so looking at how do we create economic systems that really benefit everyone. We also engage different types of entrepreneurs in the ecosystems that support them on things related to circularity or sustainability. So addressing ocean plastics, for example, or creating more gender inclusive industries like technology. And so across the board, we're constantly thinking of how do we provide more access? How do we collaborate? How do we support people who are wanting to make a difference in the world? and really have some creative people. And I think we've been doing this, like I said, some of our communities, our largest community is a community that we've engaged people in over 260 cities around the world. And so that's a large community that we've done at scale. But even in the last 3 weeks, I feel like we've improved our chops and our skills at doing virtual convening. Even though we've been doing it for a while, we can always get better. So happy to share some of our perspectives there, and to have my dear friend Todd go next.
And Todd, I want to start with a question about, because in these times we are doing, acting, panicking, whatever, and we should do some observing. So I wonder, what are you observing right now in these days about this concept of communities, both in Second Muse and around you? Are there some key traits or something that you're really observing that strike you in how communities in different forms are reacting to the situation at the moment?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, moments of crisis like this bring out, you know, definitely we tend to sort of see a lot of the panic, and that tends to sort of drive, you know, the pictures of empty grocery stores and whatnot. But we also see incredible examples of community coming together and supporting each other, sort of as well. I mean, I think that this is, it's, you know, how often do you have a shared global experience? And I think that you're seeing different communities respond in different ways. And I think that, you know, in some places, community ties are really strong. You know, we're seeing this, for example, in some of the communities that we've been working with for a while, where we see really strong ties within communities. I mean, as sort of, you know, Carrie mentioned, the communities that we work with are in a sense vocational communities. I mean, they're economies that we work with, and so, our belief has always been, you know, when a community that cares about each other, and like when a caring community and a more unified community is the foundation for an economy, that economy almost by definition becomes more resilient, meaning can bounce back from some kind of a hit. And so I think that you're seeing in places that have invested in community ties and have developed community ties, you know, when the more uncertain that a future is, the more you need to rely on diverse opinions to come to the table to be able to cast a vision as to what is the future. You know, how can we get through this together? And that tends to, in moments of crisis, that tends to operate when you have trust, and when you don't have trust, it tends to be a lot substantially more difficult. And so I think that we're seeing, in some of the communities, we're seeing, you know, incredible efforts to try to come together and support people, from communities around the world. And just a quick note for those of you that came on late, what we're doing is that we're renaming ourselves to put the city that we're joining in from. One of the amazing things about the EBBF network is how global it is, and so we thought it'd be fun to see where everybody is tuning in from.
Jenna, I saw you were nodding when Todd was mentioning some of the points, some of the observations that is seen in terms of what are you observing? What are you seeing in this community behavior, the current community behavior? One or two traits that you've observed?
I nod generally when Todd talks, but I definitely appreciated what he was sharing, and it definitely resonates with a lot of what we've been observing too. And I think it's pretty incredible. We think a lot in our work in general about how do we approach things rather than from a scarcity mindset, from an abundance mindset. And it's been amazing, even some of the communities and people who are most affected by everything that's going on right now, how people, and it's some people, but are taking the time to actually try to show up from a place of abundance and to see where there are these silver linings in this moment. I think particularly this point around our interconnectedness, that we can often think about that concept as a theoretical concept, but realizing very starkly right now that what takes place in one part of the world has a very direct impact on other parts of the world, and even within one's own community, that the decisions that we each make as to how we spend our days has direct impacts on one another. So a lot of what we are spending time on in the conversations that we're engaged in is how do we sort of build these foundations in this moment that can perpetuate beyond this moment, with this new instilled kind of mindset around this interconnectedness and resiliency, and particularly this point around diversity, equity, and inclusion, that it can so often be that in these moments when that isn't a lens and focus of the way people are responding and engaging, it's much harder to then build that in later. And so how we, in the conversations that we're engaging in, ensuring that that's a core part of the focus and engagement. But we're finding a lot of receptivity to that, and it's been quite amazing actually to see that. And by the way, I just have a few questions to shoot because I'm just so curious to have these people on board. But then I open the floor and we are here to help each other to make sense of it all, and how can we really harness this experience. And Carrie, what do you think keeps communities together and what makes them fall apart? Again, right now there's an extreme situation. You've been at it for a few years. Is there something, because unity, we read the message of the Universal House of Justice, which is the guiding light of the Baha'i community, where unity is right, left, and center. But we also heard Angela Merkel talking about unity, Cuomo talking about unity. So this unity concept seems to be in everybody's mind, and it's a really nice word. But when do people and communities stick together, and when do they fall apart? What has been your experience now and recently?
A couple of things that we have learned is that every community has strengths and assets. Assets is a very business word. It's not the most high word, but every single community has assets and strengths and amazing people and amazing thoughts and ideas. And so, I mean, if we look at this list right here on the side, as we're all talking, really recognizing that in any community, we all have things that we're bringing to the table, right? And so when we think about it, there's a lot of different things that we do to make sure that there's community cohesions and that the communities continue to come together. I think it's really different when there's communities that have a really strong vocation and that they have a calling together for something, right, that keeps them coming back. But I think at the end of the day, it's really understanding how we can tap into those strengths of each individual and the collective learning and our collective power. And so when we think about this, we always come in with really the abundance mindset of there's so much we all have to offer, and there's so much we have to learn from each other and support each other with. So coming in with really, Jenna mentioned the lack of a scarcity mindset, but I think just in general coming in with that mindset of abundance coming into the community. Some of the other things in terms of how do you keep community going is really understanding how we can all try to, this is more businessy than some other type of community, but how we can provide value to each other and support. We all show up for various needs and reasons, but how do we continue on providing value with that? And so that's being really intentional about it. Each of us as individuals, as well as each of us as a collective community, as well as some of the community conveners. I will say that one of the last things that we really think about in terms of keeping the community together is, celebrating the community, enjoying the community, telling stories, and really recognizing the amazing things that are actually happening. Whenever we're convening groups of people, there's a lot of knowledge that we have, and so really highlighting that and honoring that and showcasing it. We can always learn from others. I think that's one of the things we always try to figure out is, there are times when we do need actual medical support, right? We do actually need guidance from the scientists on this pandemic right now on what to do, but we also can learn a lot from each other. So I think it's how do you honor and really highlight the great things that are happening, as well as accept learnings from other places.
I must admit, the celebratory part sounds a little bit counterintuitive at this moment, but also we heard from Jason at the beginning how it's really important to celebrate each other and sustain each other and move forward. So learning communities or communities of practice. So to me, communities of practice sounds like what Jason was saying they're doing in Canada, working really hard day and night to really bring a response. And then there's learning communities. And I'm guessing in an urgency, you're more into a community of practice and less of a learning. Where do you find the balance, even in moments of deep crisis, to really make sure the community understands from what it's doing and doesn't go like a headless chicken all over the place, but really creates a sense of togetherness, of understanding of what their role is, and better founding their actions later on.
Yeah, learning practice are two sides of the same coin. You won't learn unless you practice, and your practice won't get better unless you learn. And so I feel like the cycle gets a lot shorter in times like this, right? It's not like you're doing something for 6 months and then thinking about it for 2 months. You're doing something today and you're thinking about it tonight, and you're doing something a little bit different tomorrow. We're seeing that with our team in New York, for example. We've been working with the hardware and manufacturing community for a little over half a decade, and with the city of New York and with the state. And now we're seeing this tremendous shortage of personal protective equipment. And even though that hasn't been a focus, the manufacturing community has. And so we're seeing this community come together and say, how can we get both sourcing internationally as well as repurposing local sort of manufacturing sort of around that. But that's a very difficult thing, right? Because these are, it turns out we have incredibly fragile supply chains. And supply chains generally take a long time to build. And now we're trying to repurpose them, almost overnight. And that means that we're going to, run into a new hurdle, every hour, which means sort of, kind of a rapid purpose. And I think one of the things that's useful to think of as communities is that when we think, oh, we need to do something, right? We need to build a building. Oh, we need an architect and an engineer. We don't really need a doctor. We need to, intubate somebody. Well, we don't really need, the architect at that point. We need the doctor. And that idea of like what we need for the purpose is easy. Our own body, if we want to kick something, a leg is more useful than an ear. If we want to hear something, an ear is more useful than a hand. I think that in the case of when we start to deal with more complex issues, we just need to think about the community as the appropriate body to be able to handle something, instead of an individual or a visionary person or something along those lines. And I think that that's when the value of the community really comes up and rises. The people that were vulnerable right now were vulnerable yesterday. We just didn't have the crisis to sort of expose that vulnerability. But those of us that are vulnerable sort of in this moment, we're continuously, and that reflects sort of a weakness in the body of the community. And in a time when a future is uncertain, you can't rely on one person's inherently biased opinion on anything. And so these are the moments where we have to master the ability of collectively coming together and practicing something, and collectively coming together and learning something, and then refining what we're doing to iterate, both to address the immediate desire. But ideally, we're also thinking about, gosh, we're going to enter into a rebuilding mode right now. Do we want to rebuild exactly what just really failed us, or do we want to rebuild something different? And if we want to rebuild something different, what is that something different that we're going to build? And hopefully that becomes a collective effort instead of an effort of one inspired yet inevitably flawed individual sort of casting a vision.
Miguel, as the first question, would you like to share it by voice so we hear some voice? Miguel, where are you calling from?
Yeah, hi, from Belgium. My question is, there seems to be several levels where the community can have an impact. On a very practical level, no doubt. On a solidarity and neighborhoods level, no doubt. On a systemic level, meaning, we can now focus with the pandemic on health issues, but we also can focus on how health is related to environment, how health is related to the poor resilience of our economic system. In how far is a community capable to propose to come up with systemic solutions? That means solutions that would not only address one, but also address one plus the consequence on the other, plus the consequence on the other.
Carrie, it looks like you're nodding there. You go ahead.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely possible, right? We've seen it. We've seen it in fishing communities in Mexico. We've seen it in parts of Costa Rica. We've seen it all over. We've seen it, literally, we've seen it in communities everywhere. So physical communities as well as like more sectorial. I think one of the most important things is for people to understand the complexities, and maybe not all the levels of complexities, but understand the complexities of the system that they're working within, and understand that we all have a different lens, and we're all looking at the system differently. And so I think being practiced and skilled, having someone skilled in the community that you're trying to work with that really understands, help a group of people understand different realities and understand the system complexities, is probably one of the best places to actually start. And then absolutely communities can come up with, what are the different, what are the barriers that we actually have control over as a community, right? Which ones can we actually influence? Which ones do we want to together? I think one of the things that, what we've learned, having done this for several years, is at the end of the day, people's desires and communities' desires actually weigh in there as well, right? In terms of, yes, we could go off and do this, but our energy and our commitments here. So really understanding, what are the barriers in the systems and how can they be addressed? How can we prioritize different types of solutions to those? So.
Because Todd's exactly on the systemic concept, because what I'm observing right now is actually people are really focused on now survival and so forth. So it sounds counterintuitive, but we know it's the right thing to lift your head and look at the more systemic view, because then you're going to be out quicker. What do you think, Todd?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's a difficult question. I mean, I don't think humanity has really developed the. So I think that your ability to build truly systemic solutions involves that your ability to actually see the various parts of a system in which they actually interact. And as individuals, we are notoriously bad at that. Because we were built for speed, not for accuracy. Our mind works in rapid response more than accurate response, evolutionarily speaking. and so this is one of those, the ability to actually think systemically is something that is inherently, should be more of a community, should be more of a community capability than an individual capability, because of the inherent biases that we have sort of as individuals. The challenge is that my ability to see this system, not only through my eyes, but also through your eyes, requires these fundamentally human characteristics like trust. So if you believe that, your view, you have an inherently unique view, and that should be, I can add that view to my view, then all of a sudden I can see through 4 eyes or 6 eyes or 8 eyes instead of just my own. And this is the I think that there's a marriage here between our ability to have a truly systemic view where we understand the levers and the barriers, and to be able to understand dependencies of different elements, necessitates our ability to sort of, and not just from like a thematic standpoint, but from like a who's affected standpoint, and from different societies and different cultures. I mean, these are the kinds of things that's like, you get fundamentally different perceptions of the nature of the system depending on the lens that you're going through. So on the one hand, I think that our ability as humanity to collectively design and think of a future that's better than the present is not a muscle that we have exercised a lot. We tend to rely on well-articulated futures from individuals as opposed to collective. And the key is that individuals are notoriously bad for being able to see systems because we need to rely on each other. And I think that this is I think that this might be a moment where we can where we need to ask ourselves, what is the future that we want to create, and how do we bring together multiple people that might have different visions of the future and actually have a coherent discourse, dialogue, where the voice of the collective is not just the loudest voice within that collective, because that's just an individual, but we start thinking about what is a community voice, what is a collective voice, can multiple sort of opinions and voices sort of from within a community actually come together in a healthy way to cast the vision of the future. We just ran a vision prize with the Rockefeller Foundation. It's called Food Vision 2050. And the intent was to ask communities from all over the world, hey, can you give us a vision of the future? Right. And that was the thing. And it was, we provided sort of the incentive to do it, but we had 1,300 communities that went through this process of community building. And so I almost think, and this is going to look different in different cities and different cultures and different, some ties are going to be stronger, sometimes are going to be weaker. But I think that in those communities that actually do come together and do listen to each other and do, there you're going to start seeing some incredible systemic views that the smartest one individual would never be able to access, because of how systems sort of work.
And Jenna, what do you think about this systemic muscle? Do you know how to develop that systemic muscle? Do you have any experience there? What would you like to share on this very important point?
Yeah. I would really echo everything that's been said, and just to share, and actually I first heard this analogy from Layli Miller at the Tahrir Justice Center, and I'm sure many of you have heard the quote about don't give a man a fish, teach him how to fish. But she said it's not even about teaching a man how to fish, it's about removing the barriers that have prevented them from being able to fish. And I think that there's so much in the way in which we can often engage with communities, again, particularly those that have been historically underinvested in and underestimated in many ways, to not see the capacity that is there to both be able to come up with their own solutions, but to think from a systemic perspective. And I think there is a role in providing spaces for that to take place, which is certainly a lot of the work that we're engaged in, and Second Muse and others are engaged in as well. I think part of the calling right now is how do we actually recognize and realize and build off the capacity that is latent within so many of these communities.
And Arthur, you had a question as well.
First, with respect to the previous question, when you already have a community spirit and everybody's thinking about each other, it's much easier to take a systemic point of view. But in our Western society, where we've all become very specialized, we've broken down that sense of community, which makes it much harder to take a systemic view. So I think is that my own question is concerning the, how do we build a sense of community at multiple levels? We've got a complex process going on in the world where we need multiple levels of governance from the local to global level. And it's quite easy to say you can build a community, people working together, sharing something in common. But how do we build that sense of community that can scale to multiple levels of governance?
That's the question, Arthur. I think it's really challenging. I mean, I think that is the question. Maybe that's a good thing for us. Oscar, maybe you have a response.
I like the approach of putting the three players of society together on this. Putting the individual to contribute, putting the communities to contribute, and putting the institution who govern us to contribute. Let's say building communities at the level of institutions, building communities at the level of collective, and including the individual in all the levels of action, reflection, and consultation that will keep the learning and the practice together.
Yeah, I was just going to point. I just saw something that Carol said, which was, again, like almost this kind of like incredibly human sort of approach, right? Some of us are just now talking to neighbors who we've lived next to years, but are willing to look at, talk to, begin to realize they aren't dangerous. I mean, if you think about the history of community, community was there because we had to have it for survival. Like if you didn't have your community, you wouldn't eat, you wouldn't have justice. They're like the basic fundamental needs. But we ended up developing meaning through our communities. And so, but as the market has formalized and as the state formalized, a lot of those functions that the community would handle are now taken by the state or by the by the market. This was articulated in a paper by a colleague of Carrie and mine, Stuart Gill, where specifically this question said, around, okay, well, we're not saying that vigilante justice, that the court system, which is effectively an encroachment on the role of justice that the community used to have. I'm not suggesting that vigilante justice is superior to the court system, but I am suggesting that there was an encroachment. As the market formalized and as the state formalized, a lot of the functions that the community used to have are taken over by other organizations. But what that's done is in many ways it's robbed us of meaning. And so there's a really important question that I think is being posed over here, which is how do we make community the foundation of our models of governments? How does it become the foundation of our markets? I mean, in our work, we're specifically focusing on community being the foundation of markets and economies, and and so we see really clearly that actually it's not just about being gooder, make an economy that's more inclusive, that's more representative of the demographics within which an economy sits. Make sure it is actually, recognizing its impact on the environment, and that's actually a fundamentally more intelligent economy. It's not just about good, or it's actually better. It's a more effective. And so I think that it's I don't think that there's a clean answer, and I think it's going to look very different. But I think that the path is incredibly clear, that we need to start incorporating this idea of community being the basis of our forms of governance from the bottom all the way to the top. And I think that the easiest way to innovate around this is in local communities, because that's where the barriers, that's where you can put faces to roles in many ways. And almost the smaller the community, the better, in a sense, because you have it's a little bit more agile in that sense.
And I think what you just mentioned about the size of the community comes in very well. Anne has a very practical question. And Anne, when you introduce your questions, maybe you want to just specify the kind of community you'll be interacting with. Anne?
Yes. Hi, friends. So my name is Anne. I'm from the Netherlands. I live in Utrecht, and I've made different efforts over the past few months or weeks, actually, to just get to know my neighborhood. Initially, to start a junior youth group, but this didn't work out because of the restrictions. So I've just focused on just getting to know my neighbors and seeing there must be great need. But I think especially this is also a bit like Northern Europe, is that people are not used to asking for each other's help, even when there's need. And that many people are living alone or isolated in big houses. Even though people might know each other from waving to each other, they don't now know who is actually in the house sick and needs groceries, very practical kind of thing. But so I reached out to all of them last week or 2 weeks ago, and I said, let's have an online gathering. We had a small online gathering, and now today we're continuing this. And how do you go about this, and what are the first questions you ask, and how do you maintain such a momentum?
I'm taking the first questions to open up a community that's not used to working together. It's excellent. What comes to mind? Jenna, Carrie?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. One is I'm thinking about, there's an organization called Interfaith Youth Corps, and they bring young people together from different faith backgrounds, and they talk a lot about the power of having just young people from different backgrounds do things together. So what they do, they don't create spaces just to talk about things. They create spaces to do service projects together. And the reason that example comes to mind is I think there's something very powerful right now around just the very core practical needs that exist within communities as a source to bring people together. So an example of, I think about, and from your question, is there could be something I'm seeing this here where I live, where having whatever the channel is, but let's say a WhatsApp group where if someone is either getting groceries or putting in an order of groceries, saying we could do this as a bulk order, right? So rather than multiple people going out and buying groceries, is there a way that it can go on a rota and people can go back and forth around doing things like that? Or if there's need to help with other things, that there's a support system that's very practical and action orientated. So it's not just let's talk about things at a conceptual level, but actually what can we do together and how can we support each other, that then builds those bonds, that then makes it easier to start to build actual genuine relationships. And as Todd was talking about earlier, trust, because the trust can be built through those acts of service and of action that's taken together. That's one reflection, and sort of tying in a little bit to the previous question around governance, is I think that we are in such a powerful moment in time where people are reconceptualizing of everything. So the lack of faith that people have in the current systems of governance, I think, creates a spaciousness for people to be thinking about what are the modalities of governance that might be more aligned with the needs of the world. And I think similarly, how we think about neighbors and our relationship to neighbors is reconceptualized. So the ability to be able to kind of build some of those foundations now that can then perpetuate over time. And the one last point around just the point you brought up, Anne, around hope. We've been hosting these, so very similar to the forums that we have now, but with music, and the power of just people having a space to be uplifted in this moment. One person shared after we had an amazing musician that many of you know, Luke Slot, share, and someone shared afterwards, this is the first uplifting thing that I've heard in weeks, right? And you forget almost actually how disconnected we are from hearing things that feel hopeful and uplifting. So that could also be something to do in the community. Are there musicians that might be able to engage with you virtually that could be uplifting for the group?
I'll add in some really, I think some of the things that we've heard are really thinking about being intentional, asking people to share their hope, right? Getting people to talk. So much of the community is also people's experience, and the small experiences matter. The music's amazing, right? Getting people to feel the wonderment of everyone coming together, having people really share out a couple of their concerns, and then voting on. You can do some really amazing things over Zoom, and be careful not to have hackers. But I think there's a lot of ways that you can actually get people interacting and saying, hey, that's amazing. Yes, let's actually think about how we're going to put in bulk grocery orders. Or we didn't realize someone else was in need. Maybe we can, help their family while their family member's quarantined or something. So I do think that there are some really very practical ways and actionable things to even just start engaging with people that you've never talked to.
For Charles, you have an observation. Modern communities are essentially artificial aggregates and lack a natural hierarchy of order. Hierarchies. What's the role of hierarchies in communities? Everybody, I think, in an ideal community, everybody feels a sense of ownership. We are all supposed to be protagonists moving things forward. Have you noticed a need for a hierarchy for a community to work better? Important, because people are still used to, okay, who is here? Who's leading here? What is my role here? How do I relate with other people? Is there a role for a hierarchy, or are there new hierarchies that are emerging that have actually worked from your experience?
I think that it might be useful to think about structure of communities, and so I think that I think that communities, anything needs some structure, and I think that structure is an evolutionary structure. I think that ideally in a community, one of the things that you heard from both Jenna as well as Carol on the how do you bring communities together is like there should be a really practical reason to bring people to community, like solve something that needs solving, and that's a really great way to kind of like make a community excited to come together and keep coming together, because if you keep coming together and you're doing something useful, it feels useful. If it feels useful, you keep coming together. If you keep coming together, you build more bonds, with other people. And so in some ways the community becomes, a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. But I think that as, when we start to think about, well, what is the voice of the community? How does the will of a community get expressed? How does ideas, you're really thinking about democratic processes over here, right? And like, I think that we don't have terribly good models of our models of our democratic processes are fairly, if you think about what we might consider the shining examples of democracies in the world today, the democratic processes are fairly weak and fairly shallow. A vote once every 4 years is a pretty miserable expression of the will of the voice of the people, for example. And so I think that this is an example of where, going back to the question that Arthur posed, which is that I think that innovating on structures of community that allow, more universal participation to feed into a direction of a community has an incredible opportunity to start to influence and inform how we think about the structure of society sort of moving forward.
Yeah, I'm always taken by your work in crowdsourcing. It's just like, I hear lots about it, but then how you actually approach it with your hackathons, the limited time, really focusing on something, seeing the results, making the result big, implementing results, having the right partners, NASA, USA is really big partner of the Canadian government. That makes it worthwhile being part of that co-creation, and that definitely gives steam and strength to the community. Jenna?
Yeah, I think just in terms of hierarchy, even within communities, I've been amazed by just the attention and orientation towards high-risk communities. So whether it is the elderly population or the disabled population, or even people who are pregnant, like the many people who I think are often not given the due respect and deference and what have you within society. It's been kind of amazing, and obviously there are examples of the opposite of this, but in the best of people's response, to see the attentiveness and just the discourse around why we should be staying in to take care of the elderly, right? That it's this very powerful moment of actually, how are we rethinking about what are the hierarchies of society, and that maybe replacing where that sort of respect and sense of deference comes from. So I think that's been an amazing thing of this period of time that, again, hopefully will sort of last beyond this as well.
And Carol had some concept about art and the role of art and to really create an uplift. And I'm not sure if you wish to, I'm just kind of forcing you here in the mainframe to just share something about what you just wrote.
It's really very simple. I've been tuning into my arts community here. I'm a maker, and the time has allowed me to dig into creating. And aside from making masks for my neighbors and family, just tuning into how the arts, music, dance, all of it just touches hearts. And even the most I don't want to say cold, but the most seemingly unconnected hearts. And so what I've found in recent weeks is that I have brothers, sisters, friends all over the world who are about creating things, building things, and that those acts of creation actually open them up to being able to not only see, but actually question. And that's where I think some of the changes we're looking for in high impact and making sure that the bigger institutions and so on change, I think begin at that level. They begin at an individual level that then finds connection with each other, and then uses that questioning to question those who we put in charge of making decisions for us. So it's just thinking about the power that the arts have to change us individually, and then the power that we then possess to change with and through each other.
And it's interesting also because you're talking makers. You can make a nation, you can make a mask, you can make an object. And there's two different communities. Well, there's a number of different communities, but some have this conceptual or create apps and so forth, and others do physical things. And I'm not sure if you, in your experience, you witness the different dynamics between communities that do things and that conceptualize, and if you feel there's a benefit in having a bit of both. I'm sure in your co-creation sessions, Jenna, Carrie, Todd, you have some physical parts, so you play with physical objects as well as conceptual ideas. And I wonder, in building a community, what is the role of makers, of doing things? Is there some idea that comes from that? Carrie, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I think there's always power whenever we engage multiple types of learning and connecting, right? So all the different types, I think it's fantastic for us to do the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, the mental. I'm really thinking about that and thinking about the different types of ways. I think one of the things that we've also learned over the years, we started out doing almost all global convening of communities, and we still do that. And there's so much power in that, in just connecting. At the same time, all around the world, people are doing certain things, and there's such power there. But we've really learned that so much change really happens in our local communities, right? And so when you really start to take things down at the end of the day, that's where things happen, whether it's in supply chains and masks are getting made or things are getting made, or whether it's in the sharing of meals or the learning, the education of young people as well as adults. So much of it actually happens in our local communities. We call them our cities or regions, but it's really looking at it at the local perspective. So I think that's one of those things. The more we can actually take things down into that local level, it's really, really important. So I think there's multiple ways to kind of think about this, local, global, as well as the very, very different types of tactical experiences that we can engage.
Jenna, I was wondering, now with your obviously your impact experiences are experiences, they're physical. We just saw recently your video, which was like amazing in terms of the people that you brought together and really rethinking the concept of finance and impact finance and how that can really be broadened to ensure that much wider communities which are sometimes left behind are integrated within this. Right now, what can you do in this situation with your communities? How do you keep your community alive now? Or are there other communities, are they forming a community because they know they're part of something and now continuing to work together?
Yeah, we've been having lots of virtual engagements, actually building out virtual programming and very much building off what Carol shared with a lot of integration of the arts. So actually just yesterday we had a session with a group that's taken part in our work, and we actually had each of us were drawing and then sharing our drawings with each other, and that's very much a lot of what we do when we're in person. But I've been actually amazed by, and I think partly because people are craving spaces to be able to process and connect at this point in time, but actually how deep how much sharing and where people are willing to go, even virtually, and that the arts being a huge facilitator of that process. So both people tapping into their own sort of inner artists and creating in that way, but also having artists help to create a space and a container that it's then easier for people to be able to process in that way. We had a session earlier this week with an indigenous artist, and he lives in South Dakota, and he shared some songs and the flute and was singing, but also shared lessons learned from his experience working in around Standing Rock, and the insights from that as it relates to thinking about how do we respond to crises and what does that mean from resiliency and community engagement. So that intersection between the arts and this discourse and creating these spaces is something that, I mean, every day we're sort of facilitating conversations like this with our community.
How can we join? One of the questions was, how can we join an existing community? So we can form communities, but sometimes there's an existing community. So what might be a good way to enter something? I'm sure we have a lot of enthusiasm. We want to bring our values, our concept, our ideas. What is the best way to enter without, being the elephant that breaks everything in the ceramic or whatever the expression is?
Yeah, I think it's just a sense of curiosity and openness and humility. I think it can be so easy without us even realizing it. I mentioned earlier, a lot of our work is around bias, but it's kind of amazing when we dive in to realize the biases that we can have as it relates to everything. So taking the time to actually recognize the role that those biases can play as it relates to how we think about engaging with different communities. So I think that sort of humble attitude of curiosity can help us to sort of both suspend any judgments that may be there and to engage really from a place of learning.
I think gratitude is the first thing that comes to mind, because these guys are the busiest at the moment. In the middle of an emergency, 3 of these people taking the time off to just serve us and be of service. That's a beautiful example of how the community can be created. And just this EBBF wider community, I think that's something that really brings home the attitudes of people. When the right attitudes of people come together, there's something really special that connects on a different level, and then things happen that would not happen otherwise. But thank you very much to Jenna, Carrie, Todd, and all of you for keeping these communities alive. Thank you very much. Bye for now.
Thank you all for all the good building unity in the world. It's wonderful.